to Daniel 3 tonight, the other image in the plain of Dura. Now, when it comes to the book of Daniel, many people start reading the book of Daniel and they get up to the 6th chapter and then they go no further because the first half of the book is all about stories, well-known stories that we have read, people have shared with us. And so the first half is not too difficult, but when you get into the second half, it's about prophetic symbols and it's a little bit more challenging. But as I go through the book of Daniel, I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible for all of us to understand what it is that God is trying to reveal to us in these last days. Because you will remember that I shared with you that the latter part of the book of Daniel was sealed until the end of time, when we would understand more clearly what the 2300 days and the 1260 days or year prophecy represent. Now, tonight, Daniel 3, the other image in the plain of Dura. Well, don't forget that Daniel 1 tells us how Daniel and his 3 companions were among captives taken by Nebuchadnezzar II from Jerusalem to Babylon to be trained in Babylonian wisdom. The overall theme of Daniel is God's sovereignty over history. And you will remember how the 4 Hebrew boys requested not to eat of the king's food and drink of his wine, and how God worked a miracle when they requested vegetables only. And they were 10 times wiser than all of the other wise men in the palace. And then last week, we looked at Daniel chapter 2. In the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he was troubled by a dream. In that dream, he saw an image. That was the first image. Tonight, we're looking at the second image. But he had a dream of the image representing the various kingdoms right down to the end of the age, to the second coming of Jesus Christ. You remember he summoned his magicians and astrologers to interpret the dream. They could not. No one could, but God gave Daniel the answer. And God came through again for his people. That was so wonderful. Now we are going to read the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel, and then we will look more in depth at certain parts of the chapter. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue or image, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all those officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald, that's a spokesperson for the king, shouted out, "People of all races, nations, language, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground, worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed him about the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews," and he named them, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon." By the way, I should mention here that you're not going to find Daniel in this chapter. Nobody knows where Daniel was. We can be assured that if Daniel were there, he would be standing with his three friends. But the chapter does not state where Daniel was. Now, they continued talking to the king. "These three Hebrew boys, they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue the statue that I have made. When you hear the sound of the musical instruments, you're going to have to bow down. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Such arrogance. Such arrogance. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. Now that is amazing. That must have been a hot fire. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "But look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Now, let me just pause here a moment to just talk about this latter part. The King James Version and the New King James Version states there, and the fourth looks like the Son of God. But the literal translation in the Aramaic says the fourth looks like a son of the gods. That is the literal translation of that verse. But the King James Version and the New King James Version, they were accurate in the intent, because we know that the fourth was Jesus Christ, the Son of God, even though the Aramaic says the fourth looks like a son of the gods. Now, 26, then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officials, the officers, the governors, the advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. You wonder, after chapter 2, that King Nebuchadnezzar didn't learn his lesson about the God of heaven. But you remember what I said? In those days, it was quite customary for the kings to regard a supreme God while still worshiping lesser gods. Now, I asked the question right at the start, why did King Nebuchadnezzar build the image? Why? You remember in chapter 2, he saw an image in his dream, but now he builds an image. Some time passed between the dream of Daniel 2 and the construction of the image in chapter 3. But it appears that the king could not forget the dream and the fact that that Babylon was going to be replaced by other kingdoms. That really concerned him. Not satisfied with being only the head of gold, the king wanted his kingdom to be represented by an entire image of gold in order to communicate to the people in his territory that his kingdom would last forever. You remember the image in Daniel 2? Had gold, silver, bronze, iron, and the feet iron mixed with clay. But he says, no, Babylon, head of gold, no, that will not be. I'm going to make the entire image gold. The whole image will be gold. My kingdom, Babylon, will never leave the scene of history. Nebuchadnezzar was arrogant and proud. He had accomplished much as ruler of Babylon, and he could not live with the thought that his kingdom would eventually pass away. Therefore, in an effort of self-exaltation, he built an image to demonstrate his power and also to test the loyalty of his citizens. In addition, there's another probable reason for the image. Many biblical scholars used to think that Nebuchadnezzar's lengthy 43-year rule was without any major challenge by other kingdoms. However, it was discovered on some clay tablets, the history of Babylon, and it tells a different story. Now here I have a picture of a clay tablet that was found, and back there they would make tablets out of clay, and they would have little objects with different alphabets to spell out words, and they would imprint on the clay a story or history. And this tablet was discovered. It's the Babylonian Chronicle, and it tells something rather interesting. There was such serious opposition to Nebuchadnezzar that on one occasion, a revolt arose from within the city that resulted in hand-to-hand combat in the very palace itself, with the king fighting for his life. Now, this is what is on this tablet. I'm translating it for you. It says, in the 10th year, 595, 594. You remember that 605 is when Nebuchadnezzar went and took the young men to Babylon as captives. You remember that? Okay, so that was shortly after he came to power. So 10 years later, in 595, 594, and remember now that before Christ, you count backwards. And then after Christ, you count forward. So in the 10th year, the king of Babylon was in his own land. From the month of Kislev, December, to the month of Tebet, January, there was rebellion in Babylon with arms. He, the king, slew many of his own army. His own hand captured his enemy. So there you have what was recorded on that clay tablet, telling us that there was a revolt in Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar himself even fought. Now look at the connection. 1 year later, 594, 593, the loyalty oath is made. What is the loyalty oath? Daniel 3:2, we just read it. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image. So that was 1 year after the revolt. So it is possible that one reason to build the image, in addition to the fact that he was arrogant and he wanted the whole image gold to represent Babylon, it is possible that one reason to build the image was to ensure loyalty to him as king, why he ordered the chief administrators of his kingdom to worship the image. It is important to note who was present at the dedication of the great image. Not all the citizens of Babylon were called to assemble. It was a select group identified as the satraps, the princes, the prefects, all of the officials, as it were. Only the high officials, those who worked in the palace also, they were most likely to formulate plots against the king, and they were also the one whose support was most crucial to the king. So that is why he invited all of the key players to come to the dedication. To prevent such a development, the king assembled these officials and had them swear an oath of allegiance by bowing to the image. Notice that it took on a religious form. The belief at that time was that if one bowed down and worshiped the gods of Babylon, Marduk and the others, then one would also pledge allegiance to faithfully serve that the gods and their earthly representative, the king. The demand to worship the image was not specifically targeted at Daniel's 3 Hebrew friends. They were simply caught up in the situation because they were officials of the government of Babylon. So at the beginning, nobody was looking at them and saying, we're going to get them now. No, they were part of the officials. That's why they were invited. Now, this was a blatant demonstration of pride on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar. Let me pause here to discuss what lessons we can get from the king's behavior. We may at times act like little Nebuchadnezzars as we pay too much attention to our accomplishments, our positions, our titles, our possessions, and forget how meaningless they can be in the face of eternity. Now, the reason why I'm sharing this is because when we read the Bible, we have to see how relevant it is to us. What is God trying to share with me when I read this story? Is there something that I can learn? The pull of the world at times seems overwhelming, but we should remind ourselves that our ultimate allegiance belongs to God. Pride, when we do or say things for the purpose of having people praise us, or making ourselves feel good, or putting ourselves ahead of someone else. Pride wants ourselves to be praised and be highly talked about even when we're not in the room. Pride is simply selfishness. That is what happens when we have pride. Nebuchadnezzar was suffering from a serious case of being proud. Now, let me just share with you some ways in which we demonstrate pride. I'm not picking at anyone, I'm looking at myself now. And as I go through these points, I have to be careful that my wife doesn't jab me in the back and say, now look at this. Look at some of these things. You've heard people say, I gave up a high-paying career to do this ministry. That's pride. When people boast about how they are blessed with possessions, that's pride. When people despise and detest sinners, that's pride. That's putting themselves up. When they talk about how much they pray and talk about how much they are fasting, that's pride. When people spruce up their public prayers using big words and catchy phrases, which they would not say when they're praying alone, that is pride, my friends. When you hear people say, in my humble opinion, that's pride. When you hear people say, when people get irritated if they're instructed, pride. When people say, and you're saying something to someone and they say, I know, that's pride. Highly opinionated, that's pride. When people say, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's pride. I told you so, that is pride. Defensive when corrected appropriately, pride. Struggle admitting a wrong, pride. Argumentative, just have to be right. And look at this one. This is something that that beefs me a lot. The time it takes to introduce somebody is longer than the person's message. That's pride. When you have name dropping of high status people, I know such and such, I went to school with such and such, that's pride. I'm talking about when you're trying to big yourself up, as they say, big up yourself, when you start to name drop of high officials. When people think they are above certain tasks, that's pride. You remember Jesus washed the disciples' feet? When people feel entitled to preferential treatment, that's pride. When people feel superior to others, pride. When people try to impress others with their looks, that is pride. In Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 13, it says, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. And God says, I hate pride and arrogance. That is what Nebuchadnezzar was full of. Evil behavior and perverse speech. God hates that. What we need to do is to look at ourselves and ask the question, is there any pride in me that I need to get rid of? Because I'm going to make a statement now, friends. And if you have any question about it, just read the Bible and you will discover that I'm right. And it is this: a person who is full of pride will not enter heaven. The Bible makes it clear, and God makes it clear. And I could spend a lot of time talking about this. As a matter of fact, next week, the story is about how Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. So that is why I'm saying, make sure that we are not experiencing the disease of pride, because we will not be entering heaven. Now let us go back to the 3 Hebrew boys. Like them, we too may be carried along by the force of circumstances over which we have no direct control. However, we not always flow with the crowd, no matter how tempting it may be to do so. Why could not the boys just bend a little to tighten their belts or tie their shoes and not cause a scene? I mean, all they needed to do was to just bend over so that nobody would see them and they would not be conspicuous. Why couldn't they do that? God does not like compromise. If they had done that, they would have been compromising their relationship with their Lord. We might be tempted to go along with something that is not appropriate in the sight of God, just in order not to cause disunity among friends and family. But this is displeasing to God. I want to pause there for a moment, friends, because this is extremely, extremely important. Sometimes we will wink at certain things or say, God is going to wink at this because he understands. Well, we have to be careful in what we think God is going to wink at and what we should wink at. Because if we compromise on the truths of the Bible, then God is displeased. Let us not compromise just in order to avoid disunity among friends and family. Because here again is another point I want to make. You will not enter the kingdom. In Nebuchadnezzar's mind, the refusal of the 3 Hebrew boys not to bow was the start of another revolt in the making. No wonder this was such a sensitive issue with him, and that he took the Hebrews' refusal so seriously. Now, just a chapter before, they were his best friends. You remember Daniel was promoted in the kingdom, and Daniel said to him, why don't you promote my 3 friends also? And King Nebuchadnezzar said, yes, I agree. They are extremely smart. They can be an asset to my kingdom. Let me promote them. And now he is so angry with them. Yet in spite of all this, the king was still willing to give them another opportunity to bow to the image. He was willing to have the orchestra strike up again and see if the Hebrews would obey. But their minds were set so firmly upon remaining faithful to God that they told the king not even to bother with another stanza of the music. Their decision was set. Their minds were made up. Two gods were involved, Marduk and Yahweh. Yahweh, of course, is God, the Father. Nebuchadnezzar served Marduk. The three Hebrews, they served Yahweh. The scene on the plain, therefore, became a contest between the true God and the false God. Their reply is a remarkable testimony to their faith, trust, and courage. Our faith in the true God will bring us through trials, just as it did the three Hebrews facing the king's anger on the plain of Dura. Their example raises a question for us tonight. Is our faith and trust in God strong enough that we would be able to stand up to such a test and exhibit the spiritual courage they showed? Sometime in the future, we may indeed have to face such a test. For the present time, however, our lives are confronted with lesser challenges. Maybe. How we respond to these will prepare us for greater tests. They indicate how we will respond when larger issues arise. The Bible has a principle of spiritual life that applies here. In Luke chapter 16 and verse 10, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And Sevilla Martin wrote this beautiful song. I just want to read the words for you because it plays right into this picture. Be not dismayed, whate'er betide. God will take care of you. Beneath his wings of love abide. God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day or all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you. In other words, when we face little trials or big trials, we don't have to worry about going through those trials because God will take care of us. All we need to do is to trust in him. Remember what he says in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25? Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life. For the three Hebrews, the image worship imposed by the king was a blatant counterfeit of the temple worship in Jerusalem, which they experienced in their earlier years. Although they held offices in the empire and were loyal to the king, their allegiance to God had set a limit on their loyalty. I do not want to conclude this study without looking at three significant words in the response of the Hebrews to the king. But if not, let us look at the reason they said this. Nebuchadnezzar must have forgotten about his experience with Daniel in chapter 2 and how he praised the God of Daniel, because he said to the Hebrews in a most arrogant way, "And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" Well, you remember when the boys said, "Look, our God will deliver us." Nebuchadnezzar said, "There's no God that can do that. You see that furnace? You see the fire? Which God is going to deliver you from my hands now?" They responded, look at this. "If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king." Look at this now. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. The three Hebrew boys were saying, look, our God, he can deliver us. But if he chooses not to deliver us tonight, it's going to be all right. 1 century before, 100 years before the fiery furnace experience, God had promised through Isaiah 43, verse 2 and 41:10, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you walk through fire, you shall not be burnt. The three Hebrew boys knew that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that God had delivered the Jews from Egypt by opening up the Red Sea. More recently, God had delivered Jerusalem by sending an angel to destroy a vast number of Assyrian soldiers. Remember, we talked about that last week? Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also knew, listen to this now, they also knew that although God is always with us, and that he's all powerful, always willing to deliver, that he does not always choose to deliver us in the way we would like him to. Only a few years prior to the event at the fiery furnace, God had not worked a miracle to protect the prophet Uriah, who preached against the crimes of King Jehoiachin. God allowed Jehoiachin to execute Uriah. There is an example of God choosing not to deliver. Those young men also knew the experience of Isaiah, who was killed by Manasseh, and also the experience of Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, who was stoned to death in the temple courtyard. God has the power to deliver us, but often he chooses to have us witness for him in death or defeat rather than in obvious victory. Let me read that again, because that's a summary of what we were just talking about. God has the power to deliver us, but sometimes he chooses to have us witness for him in death or defeat rather than in obvious victory. You remember the Christians, how they were killed by the lions and the soldiers when they stood up for Jesus Christ. And the great writer, historian Tertullian said the death of the martyrs, those martyrs, were seed for the gospel. In other words, their death witnessed for the Lord Jesus Christ. All through sacred history, even to our day, faithful Christians have endured terrible suffering that ended for them, not in a miraculous deliverance, but in a painful death. Even so, that should not diminish our faith in God, because God knows best. And we need to be prepared to live for him or die for him. Either way, it's a win. As we reflect on the experience of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we may also ask ourselves, what is the secret of so strong a faith? How could they have been willing to be burnt alive rather than worship the image? In order to develop such a faith, we need to understand what faith is. Indeed, true faith, as manifested by Daniel's friends, is measured by the quality of our relationship with God and its resulting absolute confidence in him. Authentic faith, real faith, true faith does not seek to bend God's will to conform to our will. Rather, it surrenders our will to the will of God. The three Hebrew boys decided to do the right thing despite the consequences. This is what really characterizes a mature faith. We show real faith when we pray to the Lord for what we want, but trust Him to do what's best for us, even if at the time we don't understand what is happening or why. A very significant lesson we can learn from this episode of the fiery furnace is not the deliverance of the three Hebrew boys. That is not the main point, but rather the fact that the Lord strengthened them and walked with them through the fire. And He will do that for us. Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20. I leave you with this promise, and surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age.